test this. That's one thing I never tested.
Hello? All right, everyone, let's wrap up. We've had some new arrivals show up, and they're standing outside and eating all the food. So I thought we'd better hurry up and wrap up and get some food before they run out. Hey, guys, don't leave yet. Come on. Come back. It's all right. There'll be enough for everybody.
I think.
All right. So I was thinking we could just go through these topics, and then if essentially from every group, the spokesperson could just say a few words about each of the topics, then I'll be like the secretary typing up the notes here. So like for every bullet point on this slide, we'll create a separate slide, and then on that slide, I'll put down whatever you have to say about that topic. Okay? All right, so let's start with the first one, how to read the docs and how to get started with the project. Has anybody got anything to say on that? I know Sami does.
Oh, hello? Getting started with the project.
Let us sort this out first.
Okay.
Yeah, try it. What's the thing at the top?
No, obviously after 11 is this IE thing. That's okay. Oh yeah. Oh.
So I'm just gonna edit. All right, cool. So I'll be the secretary and slide, call it docs. All right, what should we? What's your advice for newbies starting out when it comes to documentation?
.io.
Yeah. All right, cool. All right, next group, guys. Yeah, just pass the microphone around. There's a spokesperson in that group. Any advice when it comes to documentation in Angular?
Well, we also talked about how shitty the documentation is. We considered, we don't know, but maybe it would be possible to fork the documentation and help out a bit.
Okay.
I just remembered it, but I saw a link today called thinkster.io. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but it's some kind of AngularJS fanboy tutorial site.
Thinkster? Or
Thinkster.io.
Like that?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just pass the microphone around to the next group, and let's kind of pick up the pace a little bit.
Yeah, we also talked about how poop the documentation is and about egghead, and then that once you hit that the first wall after everything is super easy, and then stuff get a bit hard. Yeah. Stack Overflow has been pretty nice for us. Surprisingly much stuff there.
Okay.
Yeah, our group also thought that the sort of high-level documentation is not that good. I think that the reference documentation is pretty good. It's pretty usable, but the problem is getting started. So I think the best way would be to have a good seed project, which has the structure, which has all the modules, and then when you get that, play around with that, and then look at the videos, and then look at the documentation on the structure. Then you might have a better chance at actually understanding how the whole thing works.
Okay. Well, when you're talking about seed project, are you talking about Angular seed or just some other project you start with?
I've used many. There are many which are good. I can't say which is the best.
Okay, so I'll just remove or put that in brackets like that. Yep, cool.
Yeah, so we basically had the same things. We also briefly discussed the generator from Yeoman, so the
Okay.
Yo generator.
All right. So. Cool. So the next topic is how to structure apps and best way to use modules.
Okay, so I would go for a component-based structure. So you would put all your, if you have a component which uses services, controllers, and directives, I would put all that stuff into like a component-based directory structure where the directory name is your component name in big projects. And if it doesn't have anything to do, then it's fine to use the usually recommended one. In terms of when to use modules, just like I said to Krista earlier on, I would use a module when I need to have that my several directives or services or whatever used by several projects. So that's the only reason I would use 2 modules. And then how to structure my app? Well, it's pretty simple. Data for services, logic for controllers, and rendering for directives.
That real quick.
Yeah, so data for services for data, controllers for logic,
yeah,
and directives for views or rendering.
Cool. All right. Next group. Do you have anything to add to that?
All right. So on structuring apps and modules, or any topic.
Structuring apps and modules.
All right. We also discussed the structuring problem, and basically, I'm not sure if I have anything to add to Samuel's like setup. We use a similar, but we just have some of the parts are just simple files like filters. It's usually just a file, not a directory. But controllers and services are all directories, and then just we put it all together with Grunt actually.
Okay.
So I've at least found it really useful because we need Grunt for other stuff like compiling lesson stuff.
Okay.
So it makes sense to use the same tool for that.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Pass on the microphone. If you don't have anything to add, it's okay.
Yeah, well, just pretty much this, and then also stuff like require.js works well with Angular, so that's something you can also do.
All right.
Yeah, not much. It's probably a good idea to put your controllers in I mean, if you have a controller and subcontrollers and maybe even a third tier of subcontrollers, have the directory structure reflect that.
Yeah, nothing really to add. Just don't use the global scope for everything like the examples do.
Actually, let's turn around and go another direction. Otherwise, this group is gonna like get all the low-hanging fruit. Actually, I have one thing to add, which is like maybe obvious, but don't use the examples way for like referencing injection. So use array syntax for injection. So I mean, I'm not gonna write it out here, but it's like this style. Like, if you don't do this, you're in for a world of pain further down the road. All right, cool, good. So next one is what to put into templates views. A few notes on ngcloak, ngif,ngshow, routing, ngview, nginclude. Like, just some like. Don't try and explain how they work, but just like what are the gotchas? What are the things you should watch out for when you work with them? All right?
So we have a whole book here, but I think that's something we skipped.
Sorry?
I think we skipped that one.
Which one?
The whole thing about
Okay.
NG Cloak.
Well, so you'll learn a lot then. So pass the microphone on.
Ditto.
Okay. You guys have been sloppy. Templates used.
All right. We discussed the problematic thing of binding raw HTML to a scope afterwards, after the page is rendered. That's one problem. And you can write your own directive. Samuli wrote mine, so you can ask him. But it really works. You can do it. You can get stuff with Ajax as a string and then bind it afterwards. That works.
All right.
Also, we discussed the lack of having ifs in your views, which is maybe for a seasoned programmer a bit of a tricky thing to wrap your head around. It's just a different thinking. So, and then we had a short discussion about using different templating engines, and at least to my own experience, it works fine. So if you don't like the one provided with Angular, you can use your own or choose another templating.
Okay. Do you have to fork Angular for that, or?
Yeah, true. That was a bit of a misleading point. Yeah, forget what I said.
Okay. No, because I mean, I think. Yeah, let's.
Yeah, but it's kind of a hack. That's true.
I would recommend against it, especially if you're just starting out, because the templating language in Angular is quite tightly coupled to how Angular works. So trying to replace it is not for the ng switch, right? Cool. All right, Samuli, anything to add?
Okay, shameless plug. Use Prangler template preloader. You can find it on GitHub or npm install Prangler. It's a grunt template preloader, which basically means that all your templates and views in the globbing that you define will get loaded into the Angular template cache beforehand. So it's kind of like Dust.js templates where you can preload those up with your scripts. So that will reduce requests made to the server for.
Yeah, no, I agree. Because on one hand, you want to have multiple like templates because that's a nicer way to structure your code rather than having a bunch of ng shows in one massive file. On the other hand, you don't want the overhead of the client-side app doing an XHR for every tiny little component inside your application. It would be very slow. So what you typically do is you kind of pre-package all of your stuff into one file, but then in Angular you can pre-populate the cache, the template cache, with the stuff from that one single file. So presumably Prangler does that, but you can do
Yes,
it
it does.
yourself as well.
Yes.
Cool. Is there anything else? There were a few things that I want to add to it. I don't know if Alex has anything to say, but
one is ng. So there's ng cloak, which you can use, but actually yeah, exactly. It doesn't really work so well with IE. So actually, you're better off using ng bind instead of kind of interpolating directly inside your HTML.
So I'll type that up.
Another thing is if you use ng show, then actually whatever is all that does is essentially hides that element using CSS, but it's still part of the DOM. So if inside the block where you use ng show, you have like an image that's being loaded, then what will happen is your image will still be loaded in the background for the thing that's not shown. So for that, use ngIf instead of ng show.
So that actually removes stuff from the DOM and doesn't put it back into the DOM until that expression value is to true.
Yeah, I guess the last one, I mean, I think there's a lot of misconceptions. People typically say, oh, I don't like Angular's views because they encourage you to put logic inside the template. But in practice, it's very rare that you end up doing that. But it's something that
So I'll just put something like factor out logic. Factor logic out of templates. Something like that.
cool. So let's continue. What was the next one? So a few words about scopes and scope inheritance. Anything to say about that?
Any gotchas when it comes to scopes?
Well, if you're making like your own components, you might want to consider isolating the scope for those guys, and read the instructions carefully for that stuff, because it might be a little tricky.
Okay, so I missed that. So isolate scope.
Use isolate scope for
directives.
like, yeah.
Okay.
General. It's the hard way, but it will save time later.
All right. Do you want to pass the microphone?
Yeah, we discussed a lot of the problems, but we didn't really come up with any solutions. But I'll mention some. So if you have if you consider the scope inheritance, if you have a functionality that you need twice in the different places in the application and you can't use the same controller, where do you put the logic? You can put it in the parent scope, basically, but then you also end up with some overhead functionality, like always in programming. So that's one problem that we didn't really think of a solution for. We might want to add it if someone can think of a good solution for it.
I think there's like one way to do it is just have a function that works on a scope but isn't part or attached to any scope. I think in general you want to attach as little stuff as possible to scopes because they're quite expensive. Yeah, maybe afterwards because we're a bit short on time. Yep.
Yeah, one thing that's a bit tricky in the beginning also is to know what creates a scope. ng repeat, ng include, all these forms create a scope, and it's sometimes a bit tricky that they seem to have the same stuff attached to the scope, but the stuff doesn't propagate, so you get confused.
Yeah. When you have controllers which include controllers, of course you should never use duplicate variable names. But in some cases they're so generic that you have to use them. But then you always have to remember that you initialize all the scope variables when the controller is initialized, so that if your parent has a parent scope should have a variable, it's initialized so that it doesn't get initialized by accident in the child.
Yep. Cool. Anything else?
The only thing is that when we're working with the directives that again use egghead.io, that seems to be the only resource with a good explanation of how to do it. The documentation is not that great. Seems they're working on it, but for now, just egghead.io.
Okay. We already mentioned it, so let's not mention it again. I mean, one other thing, maybe it's a bit of a noob mistake, but I've done it myself. So root scope, don't pollute it. It's easy to sort of use it as a escape hatch as an alternative to global variables, but you should probably try and keep it quite clean. Yeah. All right. Cool. Scopes. Alex, you got anything to add? All right. So let's just quickly talk about both HTTP resource services and modules, and also factory services services and events, like when to use each and. You guys start and then pass the microphone back.
Have anything on that?
Talk about that at all? If you guys didn't talk about it, it's fine. You can just pass.
No, I don't think we really said much about it. So.
Yeah. Well, you should use $HTTP. Don't use jQuery.
Okay.
Myself, I don't really. I've had some issues with the $resource and IA caching the responses, which has been a bit of a pain, which you should watch out if you have to support old IAs.
Yeah.
What else?
Yeah, so I think it's a good rule of thumb. Like, don't use resource unless you really need to. Because actually, it does make your logic more complicated. A lot of the time, it's much easier to just do it. Coming from a backbone background, you feel like everything should be a model and collection. But I think in Angular generally, the sort of coupling between the data model and the view is much looser, so you don't as well-defined a structure, at least in my experience.
Yeah, and one strange thing which I've seen is that there have been cases where people have stored variables, something like UI state, in services,
yes.
Which is a bad idea, I think.
Yeah, so what I found weird about HTTP and resource is that if you use cross-domain resources, you will, Angular will by default always send a pre-flight request because it sends an extra header, which is kind of annoying, and it's actually a weird hack how you can override that.
That's a bit of a corner case, so I think we won't put it in the notes, but good to know.
One thing that's at least it's nice is that both HTTP and resource, they're promise-based, so you avoid the callback hell situation.
All right. We discussed the resource service as well, and we came to the conclusion that if you need something like REST, you should use the REST Angular instead of resource. It's basically a replacement for the resource service.
Okay.
Because the resource service doesn't handle very fundamental REST functionality. You have to implement it yourself.
Yeah, the defaults are a bit odd.
Yeah, it's very odd. Yep. Yeah. We didn't really have anything else on the subject.
Okay.
One thing I can add is that I once had a problem with a click event that when I tried to use the target on the event to get the target element, I ended up using the SRC element, which works in all browsers. Target only works in some. So if you run into the same problem, that's the solution.
That out of there for now. Yeah, anything else?
If you find yourself using $HTTP or $resource in a controller, I think then think a little bit about that. Maybe it should belong to a service.
Yeah.
Another thing is that if you are using post with $HTTP, remember to put the payload in. Otherwise, you're going to get all your custom headers erased, or at least content type will get rewritten.
Yeah, I'm not going to put that in.
Don't.
We're
That's
running out of stuff. There's one thing that I've run into. It's kind of a hack, but it's nice. Is that sometimes in your data,
you want to store something to do with the view, like for example whether that data item is currently shown or not, say, and but if you then go do and put it to the server, then that client-side state can be pushed to the server. The server may ignore that flag, or it may crash or whatever, but there's a neat way to kind of have the equivalent of private variables so that you can reuse the data structures, push them back to the server, but the private state doesn't get pushed back up. And that's by using the $sign prefix. So Angular's to JSON is modified, so it actually ignores all attributes that start with the $sign. So it's a nice hack, I think. Put that here. Cool. We didn't talk too much about events, but I don't know. In general, you can probably get away without using them. You should probably use services or something instead, or use the root scope as a kind of a poor man's alternative to events. Yeah. Yeah, so in Angular, there's a lot of these magic features that can get injected into different places that you don't know about, like event. That's a good one, actually. So there are actually two different types of events, right? There's the events inside Angular itself, so you can broadcast an event, and that's the internal message bus. But I think the events you're talking about are events inside directives and such, so that yeah. Okay, so. Yeah, so DOM events and Angular events are different, but you can use $sign event to inject the DOM event object. Cool. All right, so moving on. Directives. I mean, this is a whole topic. We could probably be here talking about it for the rest of today. But just a few rules of thumb, maybe. I don't know if Samuel, you want to start?
I think I said it earlier, so directives for rendering and views. If you want to render into the DOM or modify it in any way, use directives.
All right.
Yeah, basically, we add the same things as what we actually already discussed with the scope. We use the correct scope for the directives, and to keep an eye on how you bind your attributes, your custom attributes, if you have directives for custom tags. Yeah, for your no.
All right, can you repeat it then, and I'll try and.
So to bind the scope correctly for your attributes, if you make a custom element and you have attributes and some are functions and other are just plain data like texts or something that comes in, that you have to use the correct prefixes with the at and the ampersand and stuff like that. And that's always a bit of a struggle to figure out exactly when to use what.
Yeah, okay. I agree that get understanding those up on that.
Then you need to destroy the directives as well. If you have some sort of resources or you're wrapping an external library with a directive, something like OpenLayers or Google Maps, you need to remember to clean up afterwards. Otherwise, bad things will happen.
Yeah, I could just add that if you don't know how to use directives, you should learn, because they are really powerful. They are one of the most powerful features in Angular, and don't be afraid to write your own. The most simple directive is like 5 lines of code.
Yeah, I mean, I'll make that bold actually, because I couldn't agree more with that. I guess I can say. So I think I've already said this before. Okay, do you have something to add?
Yeah, like isolating scope has been mentioned so many times that I have to put a word against it. I find the most useful directives are the ones where I want to sort of like amend the parent scope. So do something very similar to ng repeat. So I did a sort of like group by directive and a pager, and those both basically like have to like amend the parent scope, and Angular does it. Could be made a lot simpler, I think, by Angular, but currently you sort of like have to export one private function from the Angular library to make it work, hash key, and yeah, it's difficult, but like found the nicest things you can do with that.
Yeah, so in my experience, I think you can avoid the link phase sometimes for directives. It can be a bit unnecessary. And the other thing, it's a bit of kind of become almost an anecdote now, but Alex and I were working on a shim for the HTML5 placeholder attribute. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So, we have an input element, and there's just some grayed out text on top of it until you start typing something in. So we started out by using some of the existing shims written in jQuery, and there were like sort of pages upon pages modifying the function prototype and all sorts of nasty stuff like that. And then Alex rewrote that as a directive, and it was like maybe 10 lines of code or something. Yeah, so yeah, really don't be afraid to use directives. And the downside is that a lot of the time, it's tempting to use an existing component, like a jQuery UI component. Actually, with Angular, it's fun and relatively easy to implement it yourself without having to use jQuery UI, for example. Of the jQuery, yeah, absolutely, jQuery components. Good. Anything to say about apply and timeout? I don't know, Alex, maybe you want to mention the thing about the timeout, the digest issue?
Yes. So especially it's kind of like related to the previous topic about directives, but in directives, especially when you're handling events and all that, you're trying to inject into the elements, and you're trying to say, but because when you're handling like DOM events, you're actually outside of the Angular event loop, so you have to use scope.apply and then shove, change state and all that. My experience that apply doesn't work in IE. Because in IE, especially IE8, the event actually fires within the Angular event loop, whereas all the other browsers is outside. So calling timeout is actually the solution to that. So rather than using scope apply, use timeout. It's weird, yes.
Yeah, so it's potentially a problem that it can cause all sorts of race conditions, potentially, but in practice we haven't seen that happen. So yeah, if you want to support IE, then just replace apply with timeout, and it's likely to fix errors you see saying things like digest number of something or other exceeded. Safe apply, yeah. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Three things. So one, $timeout is going to set your function into the eval async queue, and then apply is going to fire up the digest cycle for you if you haven't already done that, or if Angular doesn't do it automatically. And then the safe apply basically checks if the digest cycle has already been fired and doesn't do apply if it's in progress. So it'll do that for you. Otherwise, you're going to see red in your console. So
how do you actually trigger safe apply? Is there like a flag that you pass to it, or?
It's a custom function that you have to implement.
It's
in the book, and I guess Raymond used it.
Oh, okay. I remember talking about it. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, before the last one is test, so you may as well just say a few words about test and running tests.
Okay, so Angular's got a really good testing story. Basically, E2E tests for testing your directives, and then you can use the now Karma test runner to run your tests in all relevant browsers, pretty much. Jasmine or Maca or whatever the heck. If you have your own thing that you want to use, you can do that. What can I say? Pretty awesome.
Doesn't work in IE though.
Wait a second. If you have a Windows computer, sure it does. If you look into Karma source code, they have runners for IE.
Okay.
Yeah, so absolutely. You just need a Windows computer to do that.
All right. Good stuff. Okay. Clearly, none of the core team members have Windows computers because all the tests fail in IE. Or at least it doesn't work that well. Anyway, anybody else have anything to add about testing? All right. Well, thank you very much. I think these are good slides. So I'll upload. Yeah. Do you think that we'll have? That's one problem. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Let's just talk about it as part of this slide. So.
Yeah. Write tests. That's one thing.
Actually, that's probably the first point.
Yeah.
As I say, not as I preach. Okay, all right. Nah, all right, I'm just kidding. All right, so anything else about debugging, like Batarang? Maybe
Yeah, use Batarang. It will, especially in the figuring out if your performance is okay. It's going to give you a really good breakdown over how expensive your watches are. Yeah, that will help you make your app faster.
Yeah. Okay. Well, whatever. Patching Angular is fine.
Yes. So within the AngularJS, there's the exception handler, factory stuff. So what I did was I think it's in 7 places where it actually try catch, but only shove the exception into the exception handler. I've actually just put it so that the cost, which is second argument, actually put in the expressions or the scope and stuff like that. So then you look in the console, you actually have the actual object, especially in Chrome, because they actually print out object, you can actually explore it. And I found that kind of helpful. Well, but you have to patch the actual library yourself, which is kind of, yeah. Well, just look for $ exception handler, go through it, and whichever one you found useful, put something in. So.
Yeah, but it's kind of a funny omission on the part of the Angular team. It's almost like they've spent so much time writing the actual framework they haven't bothered actually using it. So. What they've built in it? Oh, there? Okay. Well, I guess it could still do with some improvements. Okay. Nice. Anything else about debugging or no? Cool. Well, let's wrap up here. Yeah. Sorry? Oh, yes, the dot.
Okay. Use the dot. So it's like the scope dot. Is that what you're talking about?
Every time you have
I think Egghead.io talks about this. Yeah.
So
Okay. Cool. Good. So let's break for 10 minutes.